I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I don't think he's going to get custody. Call me crazy. I don't think it's going to work out so well for him. But hey, listen, Anthony, great reporting as always. You get the best stories. You can go to lawandcrime.com to follow the top trending stories of the day. We recommend that. And now we have to get into what we have a lot to talk about here on the network today. I know it's the day before Thanksgiving, so thank you everybody for joining us. And we want to get started right now with the latest development that's happening out of Michigan. Talked about it at the top of the program. Let's get started. So former MSU president Lou Anna Simon has been charged with 2 felony counts and 2 misdemeanor counts in connection with misleading authorities about her knowledge of what Larry Nassar was up to, about this investigation into Larry Nassar and what she knew and what the details of that Title IX investigation ultimately happened. So she is alleged to have basically lied to authorities. This is a very serious charge, and she could face up to 4 years in prison with a $5,000 fine. She's in her 70s right now. This is pretty incredible to listen to, because here on Law and Crime, we covered the Larry Nassar sentencing months ago, and one of the things we waited to see was whether or not other people would be ultimately brought up on charges in connection with Larry Nassar. And we saw Kathy Klages, who kept being mentioned in the sentencing hearing. She has been formally charged, and now Lou Anna Simon being charged. We got to break this down. And joining me to help talk about this and also the Daniel Villegas case, you know her very well, a very familiar face here on the network. She's not with me in studio, and I always don't like that. I like when she's here. But joining us is Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, great to see you.
Great to see you as always, Jesse.
All right, so she was charged with, let's make sure we get this right, 2 felony counts, 2 misdemeanor counts. But again, the idea is that she lied to investigators. Is that easy to prosecute?
So it's easy to prosecute, but not easy to prove. And let's just call this out. I think prosecutors here, authorities are sending a clear message, Jesse. Even though we have Larry Nassar himself, who is going to be spending hundreds of years behind bars, theoretically, prosecutors are sending a message that those who are on these college campuses, who are not taking whatever pains they need to take to make sure these things aren't happening, may as well call themselves complicit. And authorities want to put a stop to that. And this is one way that they're going to get there.
Her attorneys have said this is all fabrication. This is just a smear campaign against her. How did she really not know what was going on? She doesn't know what the subject of this investigation is. She didn't know that Larry Nassar was the doctor being investigated. Does this seem believable to you?
Well, you know, is it sort of willful blindness? Did she not know because she herself wasn't asking the right questions, or did she not know because nobody was keeping her informed? And then the question becomes, well, at least civilly, what obligation did she have as president of MSU to do an investigation, to make sure that the student body weren't being harmed by anybody on that campus? So here, you know, I think we're blurring the line a little bit, Jesse, right now between her civil obligations and her criminal liability.
Well, one of the things the reason this name is so familiar is because a number of the survivors who spoke out mentioned her, and they mentioned other people at the university. And that brings us, if you go back when we covered the sentencing, you might remember Lindsay Lemke was one of the most outspoken survivors. Her statement was so powerful. She went after everybody, and she mentioned Lou Anna Simon. Let's play that for you right now.
Either.
She called her out months ago, Jonna. Now we know that Lou Anna Simon is going to be arraigned Monday. Maybe we're going to be live in there. Hopefully we can be. What do you expect from Monday?
Monday will be, you know, sort of business as usual. If she's going to be arraigned, all she will do at that time is enter a plea of not guilty. That's pretty much guaranteed. And then the case will progress from there. And I have to be honest with you, Jesse, you know, this was a horrible tragedy, what befell all of these women on campus at the hands of Larry Nassar. Trying to pin criminal liability on the president is a little bit new, and it certainly isn't guaranteed, and it's going to be a tough row to hoe. So we should be in there because this is going to be sort of new and novel, and I'm very curious to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I remember you and I were covering this constantly. We here at Law and Crime covered every survivor because each statement was so powerful, and this is just another chapter in this incredible saga. Now, one of the weirdest things that I've heard, and maybe you can explain it to me because I guess I'm a little confused here, MSU is paying the legal fees of Luana Simons. So I'm just going to say this. What?
Yeah, well, okay. I thought the same thing when I read that report. Here's a couple of theories that I think this is happening under. Number one, it's in MSU's best interest to not have its president or any past president criminally liable in a case like this, right? Because they are ripe to be sued civilly. If they haven't already, they will be. And Jesse, I don't see how the college escapes civil liability, to be honest with you. And since what is being alleged happened during the course and scope of the president's tenure there, it seems they probably have a contractual obligation to pay her legal fees in a case like this.
All right. Well, listen, she's facing some serious charges. We said that it might not be easy to ultimately prove. She faces 4 years in prison. This is another chapter, and my gosh, did this make a statement one way or another. Jonna, stand by. We'll talk more about this maybe Monday when we'll be live in that arraignment, hopefully so. But when we come back, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to focus on the Daniel Villegas trial. We'll be right back. All right, Jonna, let's break down Daniel Villegas right now. Okay, this witness, one of many that's going to testify about what happened 25 years ago, okay? So if you're sitting there and I'm in the jury, if I think that, like, for example, if I'm listening to this witness, do I get suspicious about they know exact details from so long ago? And I'm worried that maybe they make things up or they're told about certain details after the fact? Or is it one of those situations where I don't care if it's 25 years ago, 50 years ago, long or whatever, I'm going to remember those specific details? What should I be thinking about if I'm in the jury?
You know, it's really interesting, Jesse, because logically speaking, everybody in that jury box knows that memories fade over time. They don't get better, they get weaker. But at the same time, when you're sitting in a jury box and you're tasked with being the trier of fact on a case that's very old, there's a tendency to forget because you're here and now. You're seeing live, especially when you have live witnesses, you're hearing them here and now, and you can forget that this is over 2 decades old. So some of the jurors are going to be probably questioning the memory and the veracity of the testimony, and others could be getting lost in the moment.
Oh, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Let's play a little bit more of Jesse Hernandez, great witness, both for the prosecution and also for the defense. Take a look. Okay, you have a witness testifying to what he saw and what he heard 25 years ago in connection with this double murder. Jonna, would you say that Daniel Villegas is pretty lucky to get a third trial here? I mean, let's think about this for a second. His conviction was overturned because he said basically he had ineffective assistance of counsel. Now, for nobody who's an expert out there, is that a really hard thing to prove?
Well, it's one of the common grounds for appeal, I would say, because whenever you lose a trial, the first person you're going to point the finger at is your lawyer. But I think there were other issues in his second trial regarding probably one of the biggest pieces of evidence against him, which was his own words and his own confession. And I think that's probably even more important here because this is not a case that involves a whole lot of forensic evidence, Jesse. And back then, it was common not to have it. Today, jurors want to see that. And when you don't have it, even though we're talking about something that happened 25 years ago, that could really sway the jury.
Oh, yeah, you're 100% right on that. I'll tell you what we're going to do. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have more of Jesse Hernandez. This is, again, somebody who witnessed the shooting. You could say probably the most important witness you have out there. So when we come back, we're going to play you more of his testimony. Daniel Villegas, we're recapping the entire day, and you're really going to want to follow it because I'll keep saying it. If you haven't seen the conclusion of this entire saga, wait till a little bit later. We'll be right back. Wow, pretty incredible, describing the moments he got shot and his friends got shot 25 years ago. We're talking back in the early 90s. Pretty incredible to listen to this today in 2018. I'm back here with Jonna Spilbor to break down some interesting aspects of this case. Jonna, what do you make of the fact that Mr. Villegas was offered a plea deal which would have essentially set him free, was offered the plea deal in anticipation of this third trial, and he rejected it and wanted to roll the dice just to clear his name? That's a very risky move here.
Jesse, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when he was having this conversation with his attorney, because as a criminal defense attorney, that's a gift. The man was offered a gift. You can take a plea that doesn't actually say you're guilty. You're going to do time served, so you're going to walk out of prison a free person, and you don't run the risk of another jury maybe getting it wrong, in your opinion. To me, I don't know if these two had to arm wrestle or whether the attorney said, I'm with you all the way, let's go ahead and take this risk. But Jesse, it's a risk.
Have you ever seen that? Clients where they say, listen, I know I'm innocent. I want the world to know that I'm innocent.
Yeah, and that happens an awful lot. And sometimes you really have to convince a client that even if you're innocent, the risk that 12 people aren't going to believe you is so great that we need to fashion some sort of plea deal that'll give you your life back. And that is always a tough conversation to have.
Now, here, we're sitting here. The one thing that we know that the jury didn't know is that Daniel Villegas confessed to the crime at one point in his life. But those jailhouse recordings, that confession, they were not allowed to be introduced in the third trial. Can you explain a little bit more about how that happened?
Right. So part of the reason why, so we know that we're on trial number 3. And what happened after trial number 2, and the reason why we have trial number 3 is because there were some missteps by law enforcement that happened in trial number 2. So this is why Daniel Villegas is getting another bite at the apple. And because either some of these confessions were coerced, or the police did things when they were getting other witnesses to make statements that would implicate the defendant because they did some things wrong, what the law does and what the law did here is say, you can no longer use that evidence against this defendant because you did something wrong in the gathering of it. So now there's going to be even less evidence, Jesse, in trial number 3 than there was in trials number 1 and 2.
Now, I don't want to hate on how procedure was done years ago, but one of the things we keep seeing is retrials that happened back in the day, and sometimes we see situations where there's new evidence is introduced, there's new data, there's new ways that they test for things. Do you see this happening more and more? I mean, that's not really the case here where there's new DNA testing or anything like that, but has the way trials been literally tried today, is it very different than it was 25 years ago? Or investigations, the way that they're handled today, different than it was 25, 30 years ago?
I think yes and no. I think scientifically, we are far and away more advanced than we were 25 years ago and prior to that. So scientifically, and we've all come, look, we live in this age, Jesse, where everybody tunes into SVU and all these crime shows, and we expect, as jurors at least, they expect to be able to connect the dots forensically. And we all, I think, we put great weight on forensic evidence because it's much more reliable, I think, in everybody's eyes than a false confession, than a witness statement. Eyewitness testimony really stinks from an evidentiary standpoint, right? It's really not the be-all, end-all. So jurors expect that today. We didn't have that a couple of decades ago. But in a case like this, in this third trial, I think the jury is going to have precious little evidence of any kind to really connect the dots here.
John, I keep asking myself, where's David Caruso when you need him? You know what I mean? Really, we don't have that. So I'll tell you what, let's take a quick break. When we come back, one of the things you noticed that was Jesse Hernandez didn't positively identify Daniel Villegas as the shooter, but when we come back, we're going to play the testimony of Juan Medina, another person who witnessed the shooting. Let's see what he had to say. Okay, let's break this down now with Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, one of the things we can't forget is this is a shooting, right? And one of the things I've noticed in a lot of the crimes that we cover, the shootings seem to be a lot more chaotic. Whenever you have a shooting, it's hard to tell what happened, who was where, Was it something, a gunfire? Was it something else? Do you see shooting crimes very different to prosecute or to analyze than any other kind of crime?
Well, they're different in the sense that you typically don't end up with very solid eyewitness testimony because of the chaos factor that you mentioned. And a personal story, Jesse, and I think I've told you this before. I'm a victim of a crime, and I had a gun in my face and somebody grabbing me by the neck from behind, and I was 2 feet from the person who was holding the gun in my face, and I couldn't identify him. I went to the police station later. I had to look through mugshot. Could not identify him, and I was 2 feet from the guy who had a gun in my face. Yeah. So in situations like this, it's not uncommon that in the chaos, when you're trying to protect yourself or run away or do whatever, you're not getting a good look at the perpetrators. That said, shooting crimes often have different kind of clues, like the bullets themselves, like the gun casings, like the actual gun. So there are different ways to tie somebody to a gun crime.
So what does the prosecution have to do here, considering the fact they don't have the confession to put in of Daniel Villegas, and you have eyewitnesses who can't quite positively identify the defendant?
Oh, yeah. Well, I suspect that prosecutors know, and this is why they offered such a special plea deal prior to this third trial, that they have very little convincing evidence for this jury. They're going to have to hope that the jury finds all of their witnesses so incredibly credible that that's going to be enough to pin such a heinous crime on this defendant.
I like that. Incredibly credible. I'm going to use that, John. I'm going to, that one I'm using from now on. All right. Something that's incredibly credible. Yeah, I think that's right. Incredibly credible. Let's now see Juan Medina continue on with what happened in that shooting. So it's back and forth between different witnesses about whether gang signs were thrown up. And Johnny, can't help but think about the gang connection to this shooting or any shootings in general. My question is, if you're sitting back here, you're watching Law and Crime, we might not understand the gang culture or the culture back in the early 90s in this kind of area in Texas. I'm curious your perspective. That is a different mindset, right? What would you like our viewers to know about these gang-related crimes? I'm not saying that this is one, but it's an interesting connection, and sometimes people don't always understand it.
Well, I think one of the things that culturally we know about gang members is that they have zero regard for human life, particularly the human lives of rival gang members. But it doesn't matter because they can catch people in the crossfire and they have absolutely no remorse. I think what's really important about this testimony here, Jesse, is that part of the defense is this absolutely was a gang-related shooting, but it was a gang-related shooting that had nothing to do with this particular defendant. And when you have, what you can really do either subtly or maybe even overtly in a case like this is if you're trying to point to a third party, other rival gang members who would have the motive to shoot these two victims, it's basically a third-party defense, and you have to be able to show the jury. I mean, while you can't prove who did it, obviously, you have to put enough doubt in the jury's mind that they could say, well, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't this defendant, maybe it was this rival gang member, and I absolutely believe the person testifying was part of a rival gang, and that is how the jury can make inferences that are going to be important to your client. Yeah,
and it's not entirely clear. A little bit later on, hopefully we're going to play the testimony of Mr. Rangel, who is the cousin of Villegas, who said that he originally told investigators that Villegas told him that when he was driving, he saw Armando Lazo, one of the victims, walking down the street throwing gang signs. So trying to understand what was happening and who to believe of something that happened 25 years ago, not so easy. Tell you what we're going to do. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have more analysis and more testimony. We'll be right back. Okay, let's break down what we just learned, maybe learned right now with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. She's back with us. Jonna, so testimony maybe we can't rely on. You know, people's memories fade 25 years ago. So we got this forensic evidence. Did we learn anything?
Yeah, I think we learned they have a weird policy in that forensic unit that they don't actually compare the bullet to the casing when they're examining a crime scene, which I find remarkable and weird. And I suppose in a case like this, what this testimony is even more interesting because I think part of what we heard in a prior trial of this defendant is that his so-called confession was talking about committing a crime with a gun that was not used in this actual shooting. So perhaps we'll see those two dots connected a little later on.
I mean, we're left with questions here, are we not? I mean, really, we're trying to tie Daniel Villegas to this if you're the prosecution, and I'm not seeing it quite yet.
No, I'm not seeing it quite yet either. And is there an implication here, Jesse, that, I don't know, could there have been bullets recovered from the scene and casings recovered from the scene, but the casings could have been from a whole other crime since there's no connection between the two? I mean, this isn't fantastic testimony for either side.
Well, speaking of either side, let's see how this witness, Jeffrey Kelly, did under cross-examination. Take a look. Okay, so Jonna, as we listen to this cross-examination and what we're trying to learn, one of the things that was interesting in the opening statement was that I believe it was the defense pointed the fact that there was another suspect that wasn't thoroughly investigated in connection with this case. I mean, did you learn about that as well? And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that fact.
Well, again, I think this is sort of what the defense is trying to present here is sort of a light version of a some other dude did it defense, meaning a third-party defense. And I think it can be pretty effective in a case, especially if you can't point your finger at an actual victim, which some jurisdictions require. If you're going to present a third-party defense, you have to have solid evidence of this third party. It can't be like, oh, somebody else may have done it. You have to have solid evidence of that.
Wait,
So
but Jonna, we've seen trials before where they introduced that third-party suspect here. We're talking about Rudy Flores. But the idea, we've seen cases won by a defense counsel where they don't really offer that much of the idea of a third-party suspect, but jury hangs on to it because it sounds like a good story.
Because it's plausible, right? So when you take a case like this, Jesse, where I don't think prosecutors are going to be able to present a sufficient amount of evidence to really have 12 people convict beyond a reasonable doubt. So when you have precious little evidence and you have a light version of a some other dude did it defense, that's ripe for a jury to come back with something less than a conviction on all counts.
All right, well, let's see what happened because we're still going through this trial. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we have more testimony and more analysis. We'll be right back. Okay, let's break this down. Back with Jonna Spilbor. So people might be watching us, just tuning into Law and Crime and saying, well, I don't really understand why this is necessary. We know these two people were shot. We have the guy on the trial for the murder. Why does it matter where the bullets hit or how, the manner of death here? We know that they were shot. So what are we gaining from this? What would you say to the people that just tuned in and would say that?
I would say that that's a valid question, and we're not gaining a whole heck of a lot. This isn't a case where there's some sort of signature bullet hole, Jesse, that's gonna point to a particular shooter. Obviously, what the state needs to prove is that the victims died. I mean, they're claiming that they died from bullet wounds, from gunshot wounds. So the medical examiner is essentially just confirming that. But in terms of tying this defendant or some other defendant to a potential defendant to this crime, it's not doing a whole heck of a lot there.
You know what they might be trying to do is saying the trajectory of the bullets and which direction it went in, because again, we're trying to understand how this drive-by shooting ultimately happened, and we have these different eyewitness accounts. So let's play a little bit more of the medical examiner where he's going to get into the trajectory of the bullets, and I think this maybe can shed some light on our questions, Jonna. So let's see what the medical examiner had to say now. Okay, so Jonna, this was a little bit different. This medical examiner testimony, this was a little bit different. We're getting into trajectory. What are they trying to establish here, the prosecution?
Jesse, I think they're trying to establish that it was a drive-by shooting. And, okay, we know it was a drive-by shooting. What we need to know is who was holding the gun when the bullets left it. That's what we really need to know here. But step one, was it a drive-by shooting? Yes, I think that's what we've established at this point.
So if the prosecution really doesn't have that kind of forensic evidence and they don't have that direct eyewitness testimony, why did they pursue a third trial?
Well, remember, they didn't want to. They offered a sweet plea deal that he could have basically pled without admitting any guilt and gone home for time served. He could have done that. He's decided to roll the dice, and probably much to the chagrin of the prosecution. Now, I suppose, look, did the prosecution have an opportunity to say, we're not going to pursue a third trial? Yes, they did. But I think in a case like this, which originated 25 years ago as a double capital murder case, I think the prosecution was really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And look, it's not over till the fat lady sings, so we don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly. And when we come back, we're going to play the testimony of David Rangel, the defendant's cousin. This is testimony you definitely want to watch, because you could argue that the prosecution was resting their entire case on his testimony, where he basically at one point said the defendant confessed to him. I think we only have about 30 seconds or left. But so just if I understand this correctly, the prosecution pursued this case because A, they wanted to do justice for the victims, but B, it would have looked bad for them to offer a plea deal and then wait a week and say, you know what, since you rejected it, we're just not going to try you.
Yes, in my opinion, I think so. And plus, you know, they have to get a little bit of vindication for their own law enforcement officers, which is why we're at trial number 3.
Right.
And which is why trial number 3 is almost gutted in a certain sense, Jesse.
Yeah, well, we got a lot more to cover. When we come back, we're going to play David Rangel. I'm telling you, if you haven't seen this testimony, this is what made headlines. We'll be right back. Jonna, wow, this is a strong witness for the prosecution.
Yeah, kind of, sort of. I mean, all right. So we know that this is the defendant's cousin, and he's claiming, he's basically, if you examine all the evidence thus far, he's probably got the most compelling evidence, until I'm assuming the defense is going to pull him apart, because he's basically saying that this particular defendant called him up and said, guess who did it? I did. And so that's probably the strongest evidence thus far, but I don't know if it's going to stay that way.
Have you seen cases won by this kind of testimony? Somebody, the defendant confessing to another individual? Here, a family member?
Yeah, happens all the time. And then how about those really dumb defendants who make all sorts of statements after they're behind bars to their family members on the jailhouse phones, not realizing that they're all being recorded? I mean, that's put the nail in quite a few defendants' coffins. So yes, that happens, but it's not the be-all, end-all. You need to have, in any confession case, you need to have evidence that corroborates the confession. Otherwise, you could be confessing all over town to crimes you didn't commit. So is there enough there to bolster and support this cousin's testimony? We're going to have to see.
Well, we will have to see. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to play more of the testimony of David Rangel, including what he said under cross-examination. So anybody following the Daniel Villegas case, this is the witness you definitely want to pay attention to. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, this is getting a little confusing. Jonna, the prosecutor made a good point, right? So if he was pressured and threatened, why didn't he bring this up earlier before he gave this statement? Does this make sense to you, what he's testifying to?
No, this is not a good point. How old was this guy 25 years ago? 12, 14, 15? Of course, you got a kid. This is all a big gangbang situation. For a kid to be coerced by Detective Marcus, who apparently is the big bad wolf, to not go on his own initiative or even his mother's initiative and correct the record at the police station makes perfect sense, because he was a kid who was being threatened by the cops. I'm actually feeling a little sorry for the prosecution in this particular case, because, come on, this is not a great witness for that.
But the flip side of it is, this is real life, not a movie. Do you think it's hard for people to believe that an investigator, a detective, would do this? Would try to pressure somebody into a false confession?
They do it all the time. Well, they do it all the time. They pressure people into confessions. It's our job as defense attorneys to determine whether or not that's a false confession. They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to strong arm. They're allowed to say things that aren't true. Perfectly acceptable under the Constitution. But in this case, now you've got a jury asking themselves, was this actual accurate information being provided by this kid 25 years ago? I bet you at least half of them are saying no.
Well, we're going to have to see which way the jury goes. Hey, Jonna, thanks so much for coming on. I know we have to sign you off. Happy Thanksgiving.
Jesse, happy Thanksgiving to you, everybody behind the scenes, and everybody who's watching. I'll see you next week.
All right. We all thank you from here. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk Larry Nassar. We'll be right back.